Chapter 1. In March of 1988 I was still living in New York City, where I was born and raised. Back then my life was very different, very fast-paced. It seemed like there wasn't really time to think about the things that really mattered in life. Things like family, our environment, nature, and many other things that I do think about today. I used to work in a hotel in the city and I made good money, but I felt empty. In my life there only existed work and pleasure, with nothing in between. Though I wasn't aware of it, my whole existence was very superficial. Life in New York is usually crude and rough, and most of all aggressive. I found myself living in a contaminated jungle of steel and iron with stench of sewer, but I didn't realize it. It was my home, my birthplace. I got lost in its wilderness. Around the time I received an alarming phone call from my Aunt Marlene, who informed me that my abuela, grandmother, Isabel, the woman who had raised me, was sick and wanted to see me. I got from my aunt that this was an emergency, that it could very well be the last time I would see the person whom I considered my mother alive. I had plenty of vacation and sick days accumulated at work, so I left for Puerto Rico immediately. Not long after I arrived, Mama, my grandmother, got better. I decided to then take my trip and turn it into a real vacation. I visited a lot of beaches in Cabo Rojo, which is a small town in the southwestern part of Puerto Rico that's surrounded with beautiful landscapes and beaches, and it's also where my parents were born. You can still find their simple and humble people that make me proud to be a Puerto Ricano. There are other places like this in Puerto Rico, but I mention Cabo Rojo because it's where my family is from. Although I'd been in the island before, this time was much different. I fell in love with its beaches and I was in awe of its beautiful hills and green valleys. During the day I danced with the sun and at night I courted the moon. One night in particular I got to meet the stars. I was sitting in the balcony of Mama's house when the power went out. When that happened, the sky opened up before my eyes. It was spectacular. For a lot of people this may not be very impressive. The same as the Empire State Building not being very impressive to those who live near this skyscraper in New York. For me it was unforgettable. Because there wasn't any light coming from anywhere, I could observe the starry sky without interference. I know that to many this would seem silly, but for me it was a key event in my life. The night of the stars marks the beginning of my relationship with the cosmos, though at the time I wasn't aware of it. I had had opportunity in the past to look at the sky, but never in such an awe-inspiring manner. Growing up in New York I never could really observe the sky. The lights of the theaters and billboards always seemed more interesting. The skyscraper's radiance and the public lighting always obscured the sky. 42nd Street and Broadway Avenue replaced the stars. For the first time I had discovered the splendor and glow of thousands of suns. I stopped talking to Mama as I looked in awe. "What are you looking at so intensely?" She asked. "The stars look different. They look bigger, I don't know, closer perhaps," I answered. She then told me that she had seen them before like that. She wasn't impressed. I on the other hand was still struck. The power came back and I got sad. You could still see the stars but not in the same way. The next day I left Puerto Rico and I wept. While back in New York I kept thinking about Puerto Rico. I thought not only of my family, but also about everything else. I felt something calling me back to the island, an inner sort of subliminal voice. Maybe during the night of the stars something changed in me. It was as if the instant I saw that sky a small seed was planted in my brain. This psychological or symbolical seed was the one who sprouted into the obsessive idea of me moving to Puerto Rico. I called my grandmother, Mama, and my aunt and I told them about my plans. My grandmother thought it was a good idea, but my aunt thought I was crazy to leave a good job and an apartment in New York to come to Puerto Rico. She reminded me that jobs were scarce. In spite of that, I still wanted to go. They heard such urgency in my voice that they asked me if I had run into some trouble in New York. I told them that even I didn't quite understand my sudden impulse. Even though I felt like a magnet was pulling me to the island, that night when I went to bed I thought that my aunt was probably right. I decided to stop with all the nonsense and reconsider. There was no future for me in Puerto Rico. Many of my relatives were unemployed, so what better chances had I? Lying in my bed with the unusual sounds of the city, the police sirens, ambulances and the street noise in the city that never sleeps, I slept. That night, however, something woke me. I dreamt I was in Puerto Rico. I was watching the sunset, same as I had in Cabo Rojo, a huge red-orange ball of fire. It was magnificent. Right then and there, in the darkness of my room I made a decision, Puerto Rico. The next day I started to give away some of my belongings and selling the rest. My friends were surprised. They didn't understand why I was doing all this. The fact that I myself didn't understand the reasons for my actions surprised them even more. The island was calling my name. I felt it my home. I had already told Mama about my plans and she was very happy. In less than 2 weeks I gave up my apartment, I took my pet to the veterinary, went to the bank, and to the travel agency. By mid-1988 I was already back in Puerto Rico, this time accompanied by my dog. Her name was Christina. I was so happy. Like I had just accomplished something. I felt relief, like a great weight had been lifted off of my shoulders. At last I arrived. I told myself that as far as work was concerned, I decided to buy a hot dog cart and make a living selling franks and refreshments. A cousin of mine, however, heard on the radio that a nightclub in the town of Hormigueros was looking for a waiter. I didn't know where the place was but I found someone who showed me. I still didn't have a car and according to my cousins, in Puerto Rico you need a one for everything. I was interviewed at the Club Casablanca and the owner was very impressed with my hotel experience. I started work that very weekend. I would work in the club on weekends, and I would find a full-time job during the week. One of my cousins drove me the first few days. He then told me of a friend of his that was selling a 1971 Toyota. The car wasn't in great shape but it would do until I'd buy a better one. My transportation's issues were settled. Part of the route that leads to Hormigueros goes through what is known in Cabo Rojo as La Bajura, an old and frequently traveled road that goes from Cabo Rojo to Hormigueros. That same cousin who used to drive me told me that in that sector one had to be really careful because sometimes animals from neighboring estates would cross that road. He told me that a lot of people had died as a result of hitting a cow or horse on the road. One has not to worry about these things in New York. One only has to watch out for those little yellow animals called taxis. I heeded my cousin's advice then and I still do today. I bought that white Toyota. By the beginning of May I had already established a routine and I felt at ease with myself. My happiness didn't last long though. It lasted until Mother's Day, which actually turned into the night of the encounter. What I'm about to narrate happened that day. It filled my life with terror and confusion. I will never be the Amaury I was back then. All of my perceptions of the world would change. This event yanked away my relatively simple existence and transformed it into a very complicated life, full of uncertainty and even more rejection than what I was used to. In essence, I was born again.